Hi, everyone. Welcome to Redefining HR podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm really excited to be sitting down with Sabine Bendiek. She is the Chief People and Operations Officer at SAP, and it's going to be very fascinating to learn more about how she brings both of those roles together and her transition into the field of HR. So, Sabine, thanks so much for coming on the show. If you wouldn't mind, why don't you start with just a brief introduction for the listeners and viewers?
Sure. And first of all, Lars, thanks for having me. And actually, it's a real pleasure. So let me just introduce myself very briefly. Sabine Bendiek started as the Chief People and Operations Officer for SAP as of January this year, so still pretty new. And actually, I was a newbie to HR, if you want to call it that way. So I've actually done many general management positions before. And I have to say, I've come to the conclusion that specifically in tech, people are kind of like the most important thing, the most important asset you have. And therefore, it was kind of like very consequential that it ended up in an HR position.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that transition because, as you mentioned, you had an extensive business executive, kind of MD background across a range of technology companies before joining SAP in January in this dual role. So what was it that drew you to this opportunity and kind of led you perhaps to take a shift in your career?
Well, as I said, it was kind of like, initially it felt like a very sort of interesting idea. It was kind of like, hey, but I've always done general management. Why would I actually go and actually focus on like the people and the operations component? And then when you look at it, a lot of my experience is around sort of taking companies in the middle of a transformation and actually helping on that transformation, so leading through change. And what you learn, as I said, you learn in tech, people are the greatest asset you have, right? I mean, honestly, if people don't step up and don't want to really make a change, really want to move forward, really want to challenge their boundaries and feel safe challenging their boundaries, not much happens actually, right? So, you got to get the people component right. And on the other hand, people without the help of technology and processes, it is very hard to get a transformation going. So when you look at SAP and we are on this transformation journey, it really felt like a great opportunity to take what I learned from a general management perspective and really sort of use that to support SAP in that transformation, really looking after the people and the operations component, which essentially means people, systems, and processes.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating kind of blending of roles, and I definitely want to get into that with you later in the podcast. But I'm curious, coming into the role in January, obviously as a role as a leader within a range of organizations, you've obviously worked closely with HR functions and people functions over your career, but it was, as you say, your first time leading that function. How did you prepare yourself, for that transition? What did you maybe, do heading into that role, or even kind of in your onboarding period to kind of accelerate your kind of understanding of the HR function in order to begin building your strategy?
I think you do the usual thing, right? You listen a lot. You try to understand sort of what's been happening before you joined. You try to understand what people are struggling with. And then, you just also get a lot of input and feedback from your stakeholders, right? Because they typically, have a pretty strong idea about the things that should be really important to you and your people, right? And you pull that together. And honestly, I mean, the other piece is you kind of like also go back sort of, to your experience. You'll go back to, people in your network, get their thinking. And I've definitely made sure that, like with many sort of CHROs I happen to know, from my prior roles, that I actually have that active network already. So I could go back and say, hey, listen, I mean, is this something that you're grappling with as well? So that's how you go about it, actually. And then, you just, honestly, what you find very quickly is that when you listen and you sort of really, solicit sort of input from your people, you very quickly get a very good idea in terms of what the big rocks are that you need to move, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. I think, you're right. Everybody has an opinion about HR and people programs and kind of what your focus should ideally be. Did anything surprise you kind of transitioning into HR? Maybe you held some assumptions about the function based on your working with them as a client partner and a business partner, but now leading the function and obviously kind of owning the execution of HR. Did any aspects of the function surprise you?
I think what you learn is, even though, you always thought you've been very exposed to HR and you've sort of, you've had a lot of insight in terms of what they do because you took a very active interest, you only see the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's amazing when you look at the amount of things that are going on, that entire mix of like all those transactions that happen, that actually have to happen to keep the company going, to actually make sure we're looking after our people, and then really building on top of this and sort of adding those strategies, those really strategic interactions. I have to say, it is an amazingly complex and actually a pretty wonderful function. And I think it's actually at a very interesting point in time where, HR tended to be sort of that function where maybe data wasn't that important, and you really see how it's been turning, very much towards data-driven insights to make sure we're doing the right thing and we're really doing things that are meaningful. And I think that's actually a great thing.
Yeah, I think that it's such an interesting time for the field broadly. Cut across almost any lens, whether it's data, whether it's the conversation and actions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's building flexible work structures, and these are all things that are very much centered in kind of what you're building, and we'll definitely get into that on this episode. But I want to just kind of level set for listeners and viewers a little bit. I imagine most are familiar with SAP as an organization, as a software tool and a suite of tools as HXM, but they might not be familiar with SAP from a headcount perspective and a HR and people team structure standpoint. So if you wouldn't mind, can you give an overview of just the size and scope of the business and then how your HR team is structured to support them?
Sure. When you sort of look at SAP in total, you're basically looking at about 103,000 employees. And you're looking at about 155 countries where these employees are based in. When you look at the HR team, it's actually covering a very broad spectrum. So it's covering everything which is people and culture. And that basically means, of course, everything that's working with businesses. So what you'd call like the typical HR BP and HR advisor structure. So HR business partners and HR advisors, sort of working with our business partners to ensure that they actually get all the services, can consume all the services, and you involve them in driving the right strategies around their people. To total rewards, to learning and development, to culture as a very important part of the function. So it's the entire range. When you look at our people strategy, you would think, we have an HR strategy, like every function kind of like has their strategy. We were just very clear that this shouldn't be the HR strategy. It's got to be the people strategy, the strategy we really give ourselves as a company. It's kind of like a company chart, I could even call it in that way, right? What are the right things we need to do for our people? And that includes, a lot of things around reimagining our total rewards journey, really looking at the diversity and inclusion angle, and a whole slew of other things.
Yeah, and so one of the things that, as you mentioned, your background had been kind of from the business and MD side into HR, and it's a fascinating time, I think, for roles like yours across the field, because that transition into HR leadership is no longer really uncommon. We are seeing more of that. People who kind of come into that role from other areas of the business internally or even externally, because they tend to bring a level of business acumen and understanding that they can leverage to link the people strategy to. And I'm curious, did you find, and I know you are 10 months into the role so far, but are there any particular experiences from your past in kind of those MD and business roles that you feel kind of uniquely transitioned over to your role as an HR executive?
I think that there's probably two things I continue to come back to. One thing is let's have empathy for our customers in terms of those people we actually have to work with to ensure things land. And, I think it's just really important to understand, as like every central function, you have to understand as HR that, even though everything you do is like super well intentioned or intended, it's very important it lands with the people in the business, which means you always have to think about how do you truly package it in a way to make it easy, and to make it sustainable. And I think that's a big thing I keep on coming back to. It's not enough to write the email, to launch something. It's got to be something that people find easy to take, work with, and actually continue to work with and continue to deliver on it. And I guess the other thing is very much around what are the tangible successes, the milestones and the tangible successes and the wins. Just try to clarify what good looks like, what success looks like, so you can actually go back and understand what actually worked and what didn't.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised both those points, and I think in particular the first point around how we package and in some cases sell kind of these ideas and these programs to our employee populations. The field of HR has really evolved to the point where branding, marketing, and communications are essential skills for the function to be able to introduce these programs in a way that makes it easy for employees to adopt, to digest, to get excited about. So yeah, I think it's fascinating you keyed on that as one of the key things that kind of from your past that help prepare you for this role, because I think it is so important in this day and age, particularly in this environment we're in now, where so much of our communications and interactions are digital and virtual, right? You can't have that all hands town hall where everybody's in a meeting and you can take questions from everybody live. That's just not happening right now. So, your role is really interesting because it combines both the people function and the operations function as, Chief People Operations Officer. Why was it important for you to kind of come into a role where you're overseeing both of those functions, and how do you manage that?
It was actually an idea that we developed together. So actually, when our CEO approached me around this role, and initially we started talking about the people role, and then actually, it was very clear when we started to look at sort of what I could add to SAP and where SAP was in their transformation journey, that it really felt to both of us, it really made loads of sense, and actually also felt very clearly to the board the same way that it made loads of sense to combine these two pieces. And I talked about it earlier, where it's kind of like people are the most important part of that transformation, yes, but it can make it so much easier for your people if you also have a lot of clarity around how you're looking to support them, sort of on the technology and on the processes side. And therefore, it just felt like the right combination, because clearly it's kind of like salt and pepper. I mean, people in operations, without these two components that are really being well aligned and actually, having sort of a lot of clarity where we're trying to take the company, it's very hard to actually go through a transformation. And, how do I spend time on it? I mean, or how do I divvy up my time? It's actually not about divvying up my time, actually. For me, it's about making sure we actually get to understanding how to truly sort of drive those things in a very synchronized way. And we've just sort of come off our first leadership meeting, which it was actually very exciting. So like 9 months nearly 10 months into the role, actually, it was the first time I got to meet all of my leadership team in person, which was wonderful. Thanks to the pandemic, it took a little bit of time, but it's like, we started to really look at, when we look at sort of, where SAP's headed and what our contribution to this is, what are the things that we think, we can pull together to truly sort of add and accelerate that journey. That's been actually very exciting. So we're really looking to bring those things together and to really look at sort of effects where we can sort of truly support each other to accelerate SAP's journey. So that's the way I look at it. So it's not really about divvying up time. So a lot of them, they all have roles to play, and a lot of it is actually interlocked.
Yeah, it's interesting. And when you kind of frame this in the context of driving transformation at scale, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because those are there are dependencies on both of those areas that have to be kind of linked in order to do that. And so by overseeing both areas, I can see how that maybe removes some of the friction that other contemporaries may have when that's another function, and now they have to kind of get buy-in and adoption and coordination amongst two separate teams versus having everything under one leader's vision for the transformation.
I think one thing I noticed is when people, really start talking to each other from, the people and the operations side of the house, they actually, do notice that it's actually good to have the same language to even understand what the others are doing. And all of a sudden, a lot of things start making sense to them where you're like, okay, probably a lot of it gets lost in translation many times, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think most organizations, those functions operate in silos, and so the level of communication and through that understanding, it can have some hurdles to overcome. I think in those environments where those functions are separate. One of the things that you announced earlier this year that I'd love to learn more about is your new kind of pledge to flex workforce structure. And I think we're in this interesting time in HR right now where for many of us, we are, reinventing work. We're redefining work. The industrial era constructs of work, whether it was Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, happens in an office, all of those things have been kind of, shattered at this point, and where work happens, when work happens, how work happens, that is being redesigned. And so it's such an interesting time for the field. And I hear, a lot of organizations, when they look at examples of people strategies that are flexible, they tend to think more of, startups or SMBs or smaller companies, certainly not companies operating at scale in 50 plus countries and over 100,000 employees like you are, yet you are also embracing this approach. So can you just tell me a little bit more about the Pledge to Flex initiative and kind of what that means for employees and how you designed it?
Absolutely. And as you said, the pandemic has definitely changed a lot of those notions around what work means and how work looks like. And honestly, those old patterns like those 9 to 5 and the 5 days, and you do go to the office and then you go back home. Those are actually like 20-year-old concepts, 20, 30-year-old concepts, right? And so much has changed in the work, so much has changed in technology, so much has changed in customer expectations that it's kind of like surprising that we didn't really adapt work, right? So Pledge to Flex was actually an outcome. So during the pandemic, we really surveyed our employee base very regularly, and we we're trying to really sort of understand where we're going to be headed sort of after the pandemic. And was it more about a total return to the office, or would people really prefer to stay at home? And it was very interesting that more than 90%, it was actually closer to 96% of our employee base actually came back saying like, they'd love to kind of like get to a hybrid work style. They all absolutely appreciated that opportunity to continue to come back and continue to work sort of in teams, in person. But on the other side, they all got to appreciate that opportunity of being flexible in terms of working from home or working from other places at some point in time, right? So it was very clear that actually, a lot of people favored flex work. And we kind of took this, but actually there were huge variations throughout the globe, huge variations for different functions. So we kind of looked at this and we're kind of like, so, what is it that we'll do with this data that's coming back? And basically went back and said, you know what, I think it's about empowering our employees around truly doing what they need to bring their best and, have their best contribution, to work. And that is actually how the Pledge to Flex emerged. And it's really about, hey, listen, we think you as an employee know best what at any point in time is sort of the best way to work. What we are about is we want to enable you, we want to enable your manager to ensure that one actually really works, makes sense for our customers. And actually, you have the infrastructure in the offices, you have offices that enable you to really do that collaboration, to do that bonding. But on the other side, we want to give you that flexibility around technology, but also around management style that you can actually also, be at home, be flexible to make sure you also have an opportunity to look after your whole life, not just sort of after work. And that's what happened. And actually, it's actually being greeted with a lot of very positive resonance. And we believe it's actually a wonderful way to go ahead, but it actually does entail a lot of work or a lot of enablement actually also for the leadership teams. How do you truly manage in a fully hybrid work world? And that is one of those that we're currently doubling down on. So how do you create the local frameworks to ensure you're really doing the right thing tax and legally, and still for the employees in all the countries around the world, because we have to do this for 155 countries. And how do we make sure that all our leadership, all our leaders truly understand how to really use this, and how do you continue to form great teams in a truly hybrid working environment?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that last point as well, because I think as we're creating these new flexible constructs, right? I think that the history of HR has been more playbook driven, right? We have kind of set practices of how we tend to think about performance or learning or DEI or recruiting. In these new flexible constructs, we're rewriting those playbooks. And I think that it's important for HR leaders to be remembering that it's not just about kind of redesigning these new flexible constructs, it's supporting both our employees and then very importantly, our managers to be able to do those functions effectively under these new constructs. Because for many of them, this flex work, hybrid work, it's not just new for their employees, but it's new for them both as an employee and as a leader. And so having that guidance and support, I think goes a long way. When you think about this new kind of flexible work construct, how do you see that connecting to SAP's kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives? Does it change at all how you think about DEI within SAP?
I think it can definitely help. Because of course, I mean, when you look at it, I mean, having that flexibility around sort of where do you work and how do you work and when do you work to a certain degree, I think it does help to be attractive to populations of varying backgrounds, and also to make sure that you continue to actually drive sort of the geographical diversity as well, right? Because it does enable a lot of virtual teamwork a lot better. Because one of the interesting things we learned in the pandemic, by the way, was that usually when you had kind of like sort of 10 people in a room or 5 people in a room, and there's like the odd 2 people sort of calling in virtually, we all know how that feels, and we all know how difficult it is to actually feel included, right? And what we all learned in the pandemic was when everybody was virtual, all of a sudden, everybody was kind of like on the same footing in terms of, being heard, getting sort of, their arguments into the discussion. And interesting enough, it seemed to be so much more inclusive. So when you look at hybrid work styles, obviously, there is an opportunity of actually keeping some of that good practice to make sure you are really truly sort of enabling different people with different backgrounds and different personalities to actually be heard, be seen. But on the other side, yes, you have to make sure that you really accompanying this, and that you really accompany this with sort of the right set of enablement around sort of how do you build those teams, how you continue to drive a fully inclusive culture, both virtually and in sort of real, person meetings and interactions.
Yeah, well, I think you raised some great points, and it'll be so interesting to see as more organizations, especially enterprise and sizable organizations, begin adopting these flexible constructs, how that does impact all of these areas, from DEI to recruiting to retention to innovation. And I think we're really in the early stages of this broader kind of new chapter for the field broadly, for HR, for people operations. And I'd love to get your perspective. When you think about our kind of opportunity to really redefine work, what gets you most excited about the future of HR?
Well, I mean, I'd love to follow on to the comment you began with, which is really around, the change that's happening there. And when you look at it, we all, know that you go through different phases in life, and we all have, those different, phases where you need sort of more flexibility, less flexibility, where you enjoy going to the office, where you actually, feel like really stressed out about going to the office. Maybe your commute is too long. Maybe you have to look after, your children, whatever, right? And just sort of adding that flexibility, adding that hybrid work style, I think is going to help us a lot on making sure we're attracting people who maybe before felt, it just wasn't their kind of thing, and they couldn't really sort of sign up for this with full commitment. And we can keep people, retain people throughout those different phases in their lives. And I do think that's a great opportunity for us. At the same time, I think we will need to continue to ensure that everybody kind of like keeps that open mind, keeps that constant learning. We've always talked about constant learning. I think now it's actually real. Now it's real around sort of that continuous evolution that, you need to continue to learn new things, try new things, learn from mistakes. And therefore, I think that's the piece I'm actually really most excited is always hard because I think there's many things to be excited about. But if you look at that, that's one of those concepts that kind of leads into so many of our HR topics. It, yes, of course, leads into individualized learning journeys. It leads into having the right culture, like a culture that really sort of focuses on being inclusive, that focuses on really providing that psychological safety. That at the same time is a culture that really drives people to want to perform, to want to actually excel, and to still feel good and safe about experimenting and learning from mistakes. And of course, a culture that really sort of makes sure you develop great leaders that understand how to actually bring their people constantly onto kind of like the next step of their journey and enable them to continue to grow and thrive. And I think those are all great things that I think really mean that HR is going to be even more right in the midst of everything a company is doing for their future success. I think HR has such an important function in safeguarding companies' ability to continue to be successful, to continue to evolve, to continue to deal with even disruptive changes, because we are the ones that can help building those resilient organizations that everybody is hoping to get to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on all of those. And I think it underscores the evolution of the field. We talked about, everything kind of goes through evolutionary cycles from the, maybe more traditional, transactional, administrative type HR functions to this much more strategic, proactive business function that's focused on people where we are today, and certainly where leading organizations are today. Sabine, I really enjoyed learning more about your career path and your journey to SAP. We close every episode with just a quick lightning round to help the viewers and listeners get to know you a little bit better. So you can try to keep your answers to around a sentence, and we will kick things off. Are you ready?
I try.
All right. So we always start with music. Who are your top 3 artists that you find yourself listening to most often?
I hope I'm allowed to use music styles. Love Brazilian music. Actually, so the modern one, sort of a bit towards, the Brazilian funk, actually. And actually love good old British retro, punk wave, and actually, surprising but true, a bit of metal as well.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, we can have some separate conversations on metal as well. I think we probably have some common musical tastes. What is your least favorite HR buzzword?
Maybe it's, I can't believe it's so hard to get the data together.
Yeah. I think, well, again, that's another point that underscores this transition that we're in from the kind of more legacy transactional HR to strategic HR. That's an absolute essential for modern HR.
It's amazing, when you look at it, so many people are kind of like, oh, we have different data about this. And you go like, okay, so single source of truth, I think is a cool one.
Yeah, I think that's an imperative for most of your contemporaries' roadmaps if it's not in place today. If you weren't in HR, and I'm going to, obviously you've had a couple different careers, so I'm taking kind of business and MD type roles off the table in this questions as well. If you weren't doing either of those two things, what would you be doing?
I'd probably work for some institution looking at reinventing the future of learning.
You mentioned having those kind of HR peer networks, right? That you can talk to about ideas, challenges and hurdles. How important have those networks been for you, kind of in your onboarding experience at SAP?
Hugely important. Just going back to people who kind of like share similar challenges and having those exchanges around sort of what they think, what they've seen. And actually also, maybe about getting some feedback around how important, just getting their perspective. Is it like a very big thing in their view as well? Or are you like special in terms of thinking this is like really big? I think it's hugely helpful.
Well, Sabine, I really appreciate making time to come on the show and helping us learn a bit more about your career journey to HR and what you're building in SAP. So thanks so much for making time.
Thanks for a great discussion. I really enjoyed it.